real briefly, I'm going to talk about, unfortunately, some of the stuff we talked about earlier today, but maybe get into a little more specifics about how the management affects birds and what we kind of going on. But first, before we go on, I do want to just mention that, you know, we've been out there today talking about quail. But as any private landowner knows, there's lots of things to consider. You got to figure out what your priority are, what you're going to do when you have a piece of property. There's a lot of things, and kind of what you currently have out there might generate or have ideas about what you maybe potentially can have. So it's kind of a good balancing act to figure out what those expectations might be before you go into something. And then most importantly, when I say it's hard to maximize, it's almost impossible to maximize everything on every acre out there. You just can't do it. So if you buy a piece of property thinking you're going to have the greatest bobwhite population, the greatest cows, the greatest timber, the greatest everything, you're going to be pretty disappointed because it's probably not going to happen. We've already talked a lot about this today, right? I mean, Raul covered it. We talked about it out in the field, so I don't have to go into it in great detail. 2 points. I'm going to stress it again. Quail are good at dying. Quail are good at breeding. And the good news is if you do good work for them, that help cause populations go upward. If you don't do anything, they're going to decline just as quick, if not quicker. Survival is key. As Theron earlier today said, you know, dead hens lay no eggs. The goal is to get those chicks out of the egg, get them grown, get them to the next breeding season. And it all starts with your overwinter survival. And that's pretty important as we move forward. So I think we've covered this slide enough, right? I mean, we've kind of talked a lot about habitat, so I can I'll just move on past that. But and I think Jeff and others talked about why we've lost that habitat or what's going on. But also I would like to mention though, it's just not the direct loss of habitat, it's the change in modification in some of those habitats. So higher timber densities, timber volumes, clean forestry, you know, tame pastures, all that stuff. I mean, in essence, the property's still there, the habitat, but it's just not usable anymore. So it's not a direct loss, but it's still, that's what fragmentates our habitat out there. All right, you all seen the declines again. I got Raoul's strike on there for them. But it goes to show all these birds. So you can look at Bachman sparrows, bobwhite, shrikes, we could put meadowlarks, lots of species up there, vespers. They're all doing the same thing. So that'll tell you something. Habitat is what these species require. They're all kind of doing the same thing. This is just another way to animate the same problem. This is up in North Florida. This is a piece of property on tall timbers. 1966, that picture was taken. This area is called NB66. No burn since 1966. Somebody back in 66 was smart, do a little research project. And here it is, 2003, 37 years later. I mean, it's not even the same. Just because there's been no fire, no birds, no bird species, no anything. And then kind of the same thing over there. So as I mentioned out there, these birds aren't nearly as you know, strong as they used to be. They can't get that recruitment from outside. That's why we got to manage them. And as we talked again today, everything starts with fire. It's really your cheapest and easiest tool as a land manager is fire to put out there. It may be a big problem sometimes to get permits and do all that. But from the standpoint of cost effectiveness, it's the number one. It's going to give you your biggest bang for the buck. And as Mr. Stoddard said way back in the day, if you're called a firebird, probably need fire, right? I mean, it's pretty common sense. Even I'm good enough to figure that out. But, you know, you got to do it as a landowner. You got to figure out what your wants and needs are. But it's just not fire. It's a type of fire. It's the application of that fire that's important. And fire frequency, I like to say, is the king. We've talked about it. These systems need to burn. They need to burn frequently. They all depend on it, all those whole suite of species out there. So I cannot emphasize that enough, how important it is to get that frequency right before anything else. As I mentioned out there, if you have something that's in a 2-year rotation and you keep driving around and you're like, man, that side over there just doesn't look very good. I'm gonna go work on that for the next couple of years. Well, what you had in a good rotation, good 2 years, is now no longer that. All your hard work, all your efforts, all those birds are no longer there. Now, of course, sometimes you got to do more frequent. Sometimes you got to extend it longer. Maybe grazing in certain areas is taking care of a couple of those burns for you so you can get by with it, depending on stocking rates and everything else. But fire frequency is key. Here's kind of a map that shows 1 to 3 year fire frequently, clearly shows kind of where we're standing historically within that 1 to 3 year fire frequency. And you can kind of look, almost all of Florida fell within that. Kind of talking what Raul mentioned earlier, it's probably lightning strikes, who knows what was going on, Indians, cattlemen, ranchers. But for some reason, we've been able to pretty much maintain that. And the system depends upon that type of frequency out there. It is key. Here's what happens when you don't burn. Quail aren't using that. Turkeys aren't using that. Heck, I can barely walk through that and take the picture. You know, no bare ground, no diversity, no seed production. There's not much going on there. And this happens quick. I mean, this goes from good to bad pretty quickly over time. Here's another example. Looks good, but what don't you see there? There's some stuff missing. The bare ground, that thatch is thick that we talked about. This is an area that was burned, you know, and probably let to go 3.5, 4 years. It looks good. I'd like to look out in my backyard and see it, but from the standpoint of bobwhites, the way they work, it's just a little bit too thick, especially that thatch is what starts to develop. Here is some of just the relationships between fire and some species about the importance. And I threw up a mix of different species so you all can see kind of how important it is to all of them. The overwintering grasshopper sparrow, you can clearly see when these birds are coming back into town what they're selecting. Those things that had 1 year rough. Bachman sparrow abundance, the more you burn in a 5-year period, the more Bachman sparrows you're gonna have. Kind of the same thing with quail. The longer you go between your burns, the less quail you're gonna have. But it's pretty interesting that they're all interrelated. They all almost follow the same path and same trajectory on the landscape. Oh yeah, I love this slide. Now it's old. You can see, I mean, it's 15 years ago, man. I've been doing this a long time. This is out on Mayaca River State Park, just up the road from here a little bit. Covey call count, we did. I did the covey call count in 2007. Stood right here in the middle to do my count. This is my 500-meter grid that Raul was talking about earlier. As I look to my east, that's what I saw, that top picture was burned, what, 6 months, 5 months before I did the covey call count. On the bottom, it had been burned 3 years prior. So it had a 3-year rough on it. Covey call count, 7 coveys heard in where the 5-month fire was. Not a single covey heard when I looked or listened to the west. Same landscape, same habitat, everything was the same, except one had extended their window of fire and the other one did. That's how quickly it can happen. I promise that was the microphone. So that's kind of a real world, on the ground, just kind of example of how quickly things can happen. And you can imagine if they didn't burn that in July of 2007, there probably wouldn't hear any there that period of time. But it goes to show 7 coveys in 1 point is pretty strong. It goes to show those prairies, when managed appropriately, can support a lot of birds. Scale of fire, we talked a little bit about this. These large burns. You know, when I talk large burns, I'm probably talking, you know, the smaller the better. So, I mean, anything over 350 acres considered a large burn in my book. You know, I'd like to see burns at the 40-acre level, but I know that's not feasible. But you can kind of see what it does. Habitat's good, demographics poor, right? The birds just aren't there. Survivability declines, exposing to predation. And this is probably the most important. These large-scale burns, if you burn out an entire landscape, take a lot of birds' nests with them. The later you push them back, if there's something happened, either it gets too dry, too wet, and they can't nest, you're kind of putting everything in that last, egg basket. So it's important. And those fancy little graphs over there just talking about hazard rates, more birds move, their hazard of death is a little bit higher, we get it. It is what it is. Small scale, almost the exact opposite, right, of what we were talking about. Demographics good, patchy mosaic best, survivability goes up, 50 to 60% of your landscape. But that's important to pay attention. If you got cattle out there, you may want to back off a little bit because cattle are going to take some with it. The weather's important. Just keep an eye on it, right? If you think it's going to be really dry, you may want to burn as much. All these things are important as you're out there to pay attention to. Oh, geez, another one on scale. This is actually a diagram or a graph or a picture, I don't know what that is, from the Webb. We were trying to get creative on the scale issue. How can we burn, the Webb's a big piece of property, Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area, over 60,000 acres. Probably not feasible to burn at the 40 to 75 acre range to do all that and get half of it done in a year. So we were trying to get creative and think we did on how we can burn big, large landscapes, but also be feasible for the birds. So we came up with these ideas, these real long and skinny burn areas. If you burn them, birds can quickly move from one zone to, from a burn. They only may have to go a couple hundred meters and they'll be within an unburned area, be able to get escape cover. So all that's important. And then the way the burn is on the landscape's important. Clean burns versus very, burns that consume just about everything. All these type of things as managers are important to those birds when you're out there, thinking about the whole process. And as you drive around, and you continue to have stuff like this happen, well, eventually, what's going to happen back there? It's going to go bad. I mean, next thing you know, you're going to have oaks growing up. So that's something, while that might be good this time around, but next year you're going to pay attention to that and get back in there and burn those acres, or they'll start to get away from you. That's kind of how it happens. Season of fire, again, frequency is most important, then the scale issue, and now frequency. We like to see a variation as much as possible, depending on what your objective is. You might at certain times want to increase more grass on the landscape, so you're going to have more of a growing season or more of that midsummer type fire. Other times you're going to want to try to encourage other things to grow. You might do a winter or dormant season fire. All those play into how property looks, what your needs are, what the objectives are at that given time. You can play a lot and dictate a lot just with the fire and when you apply it to the landscape. Spread burns out across the entire landscape, burn when you can. You can see nests tucked up pretty soon after burning, a nest tucked up underneath that palmetto right there. And that's not long after fire, so they will get back in there. Ideally, if it was me and I wanted to do it, I'd try to burn March through May, probably leaning a little bit more towards that March and April period. But sometimes you need that May burn. You may want to do it. Burning can be conducted throughout the nesting season at appropriate scale. And as we talked about, breeding season's a long time, right? These birds like to breed. So, I mean, if you happen to burn up a couple nests, they'll figure it out. They'll get back on it and do it again and nest again. I would rather burn up a few nests than have that habitat flip and go bad on us. And then you've lost everything. So that's why it's important to do Oh, okay. This is not taken from data from radio telemetry birds done up at tall timbers. So, but it's still, the reason I put it in here is to prove the point is how quickly these birds make that progression to those burned areas, right? I mean, they need it. Those chicks need it. These are where the hen is taking those broods during that time of year, is almost exclusively moving into those burned areas. Sometimes they're probably even nesting as quickly. And that's probably that trade-off, right? Being next to super good brood habitat to being, I might get eaten over here. But that hen is trying to make that trade-off between getting eaten and having her broods right next to it. But it just goes to show and emphasize the point of how important it is to have those burned areas on the landscape. Birds need it. Those chicks need it. Okay, integrated management. You might as well use all the resources and tools and options available to a landowner. Roller chopping. We talked about this. This is the picture taken at the same place. Not so good. Far top picture, just a picture of the rhizome being severed with the drum chopper. That's exactly what you want. Get back in there with your follow-up picture, and then 1 year later, it's a pretty big transformation, basically from no quail habitat to where now we can get birds back in that landscape. You know, relationship. I want you to look at this slide and then the next one, but you can see just keeping of where that tipping point is, where that line on that top graph starts to go down. At what percentage? About 33%. Saw palmetto, you can start to see a pretty rapid decline of bobwhites when it goes down. This is just to go show it. Chopping's better than not chopping. Oh, here we are. Bachman sparrows, meadowlarks. Man, it's pretty close, right? Between 30 and 33, 35%. There's something going on with those palmettos in that period of time. And when you have that much density of palmettos, how things start to go down. Some of y'all could probably go up here and find some of these range management journals from the 30s. They were talking, that's a long time ago. They were roller chopping in areas, and they were talking about the palmetto back there in the 30s being 20 to 25%, 15%, considering that heavy density. So it goes to show that some of these systems probably weren't naturally 75, 80% saw palmetto. It's taken up a lot of usable space to be able to do it. But there is something going on once you start to get above 30% of saw palmetto for bobwhites. And these are just some of the guidelines that we use or that I use on my areas that we roller chop. We like to use a double jump offset, like an N7 or bigger. Since you got the offset drum, we only do one pass, not going back and forth, just a single pass. We like to pull it with a skidder. This is probably the most important for that kill that you want on those palmettos, that good soil moisture. I'm not talking wet. I'm not talking like, swimming pool wet, but you want it squishy when you go out in there. That allows those blades of that drum to go through, sever those rhizomes, get right back out. You're not flipping soil. You're not just tearing up dirt, getting in the dirt. Season kind of depends. Are you looking for slough grass? Are you looking for more forbs? Depending on what you want is when you may want to tweak that season when you do it. I always try to shoot or have contractors and folks shoot for that 10 to 12 acres per day. Any slower than that, doesn't hurt anything. It's just probably not very cost effective. But once you get much faster than that, believe it or not, that drum, and you guys have probably done a lot more chopping than I have, but that drum starts to bounce. And once it starts to bounce, you might actually miss some of those rhizomes on the landscape. It just starts to bounce a little bit on you. So that's what we shoot for. And then follow up with fire, as we talked about earlier. You want those things to start growing again, sucking up all their carbohydrates, and then pop them with that fire. So that seems to be important. All right, timber, I know it's not a huge, big deal down here, but I just threw it in. It's important. One timber harvest can make a big difference. On these thinner stands, we like to promote, between 70, 120 trees per acre on the smaller ones. you need sunlight, same thing we've been talking about, right? It's just another tool, provide some income, provide some revenue. It's important, especially the more north you go, the timber really plays a bigger part. You know, herbicides and fire, that's not a real big issue around here. If you got a bunch of hardwood issues, it can make a difference. But we talked a little bit about this. I told you I was going to have a slide. This is the same exact area. You can see the old tree up there. I'm not lying to you. It's the same picture. You know, on these restoration sites, right? Fire wasn't going to do anything here, but probably cause a bigger fire somewhere else. So we went in there beforehand, used Brontosaurus, used every tool we could find to operate in there, got everything cut back, and now we can maintain that with fire. Wasn't cheap, right? I mean, it's expensive, but once the work was done, we were able to just get in there and use it through fire. So you can do these. It's better not to let it get like this, but if you need to move forward with it, you can. It's doable. The practices are available to you. Management of rangeland, you guys probably know a lot more about this than I, but these are just kind of some of the things, you know, I like to follow. Obviously, it's more challenging because you got something else you're dealing with, right? You got to deal with the cows. Before, you only had to deal with the habitat and the quail, and now you got the quail on the landscape, or the cows. Obviously, rotational grazing, you don't want those cows to eat everything before the quail have an opportunity to enjoy them as well. Provide sufficient habitat, the food, the cover, and everything on the landscape throughout the year. If cows, quail, whatever stocking rate are out there together, the cattle are going to win every time, right? I mean, that's common sense. And we talked about this a lot, Raul did, creating your edge, your fallow areas out there, maintain brooding areas of weedy plants out on the landscape. All those things are important out there. Like I said, most excuse me, most in the room know more about this than I. And then here's just a list. I threw this up there, just a list of plants that we probably talked a lot about today that are out there. And then as you can see, some of those, hopefully they show up. Do they show up? The bold species ones? There's supposed to be some bold ones that show up, and they're also high quality forage out there for the cattle. It's kind of silly. And then as we talked about the additional practices, it's not a silver bullet, meaning you can't have crappy habitat, think you're going to go do these practices and then have tons of quail. Doesn't work like that. Got to have good habitat before you do it. If not, you're just wasting your money. It doesn't do anybody any good. Obviously, out of all these, if I was going to pick one, the supplemental feed, nutrition is what I would pick next. Then I would pick the predator management, so forth and so on down the line as it relates to importance on there. That's one of the Sesbania plots weaving throughout the woods, that one picture there at Babcock Webb. And as we talked about, our nest predators, snakes, mostly corn snakes, rat snakes, oak snakes, probably our number one nest predator. Coons, possums, armadillos, and all those are important. So yeah, that's good. So, and I'm gonna, after this, I should have said when I started, after this, Raul asked me, we did a project over on Babcock Webb. So if y'all bear with me after we get through this last summary slide, I got 3 or 4 slides on our research project that we did at Babcock Webb. But just in summary of what I talked earlier, you guys can read it. This is basically what we've talked about all day. This is probably the most important take-home message. Can't just do one of these practices and walk away and think you're going to have some killer bobwhites out there. You got to continue to do the practices. It's continual. Bobwhite management is work. I mean, the people in the bobwhite world, we're kind of obsessed. I mean, that's pretty much all we do is think about quail, talk about quail, want to shoot quail. I mean, that's all we really do. So, let me go back. Did anybody have any questions? I think we covered it a lot today, but does anybody have any questions on the presentation? I know I went through it kind of fast, but I figured we covered a lot of it.
After the presentation, you presented everyone's convinced that fire is great. We've also talked about how difficult it is. Are there any programs do or anything that makes it easier for everyone to light a fire?
They're working at it. You know, we are lucky in the state of Florida from a legislative standpoint. We are a quote unquote, I don't even know if this is a term, but a right to burn state. You do have some legislative backing for your ability to burn. Still doesn't mean you're going to get sued, right, if something goes wrong. But there is some rules and regulations in place to help you overcome those challenges as a landowner. There are those programs that are available. Several of the agencies are currently working to try to, and private NGOs like Tall Timbers, to develop private land burn teams that can actually go out on the landscape, consult with landowners, and actually help them implement those burns. You can see there where they're working on the dynamics is who pulls the permit, who doesn't pull the permit on stuff like that. So I think as a state, we're moving better and better in the direction to help you put fire on the landscape. I don't think we're there yet. But I do know from a legislative standpoint, from some of your rights and your abilities to be able to burn, what your obligations are, have improved and are some of the best in the country to be able to do that. I said, still doesn't mean that, you know, if something goes wrong, that Morgan & Morgan are not going to knock on your door. But they're trying to move it in the right direction on something like that. Yes, sir.
Where do we get that information?
About all those programs, NRCS websites have a lot on it. The Florida Forest Service page, which is just that, the Florida Forest Service, they have a wealth of knowledge on the Florida Forest Service website. You can contact your local Florida Forest Service county, what are they called, supervisor? I don't forget. Yeah. Yep.
Well, I've got all of the things, all you need is kind of smoke them up, get burned up.
Yep.
You know, it took 3 days to get burned up.
Yeah, I understand. That's right. I mean, and that's it. I mean, did you go through the process of pulling the permit, doing all that type of stuff in advance?
I pulled the permit 2 more times. I use that same number plus the fire department every time they come out.
There you go. See, you got to see. Yeah, with that one number. But yeah, that's it. If you do that, let the forestry know, so when they get the call, they can just shut down all those people. Hey, we know we got a prescribed fire, we got a burn pile, we got something going on out there. That's right, and they shouldn't. But I mean, it is the government we're talking about. I shouldn't have said that, but it is what it is. You can edit that out of whatever's being recorded or videoed. But the programs are there. We're trying to check the NRCS site, check the Florida Forest Service. They have a wealth of information on there about programs that are available. Yes. That day, sometimes they don't leave. You know, if they can find somewhere to hunker down or just switch around or something like that, they get back in there pretty quick. And those hens, especially with broods, they'll move in very, very quick to get back in there. All right. So real quickly, this is a project that we did down at Babcock Webb, kind of a fire management project. I'll thank Seth for his picture that he took. You can see it's a challenging landscape. We're always burning over all the water and everything down there. But that is Babcock. It's pretty wet sometimes place. It's a great picture. It's a cooperative project, Tall Timbers, UGA, Mississippi State, and then FWC. Did it over about a 4-year period. It's probably one of our biggest projects. And involved, you name it, it had all the aspects of a project. But this is kind of what we were after. Scale, how important is scale on the landscape? How does it affect birds on the landscape? And then does it actually affect how many you can have on the landscape that we were doing out there? Field work over the course of the study, we captured and radioed, what's that, 275 adults over a 3-year period, 195 chicks over a period, 22 broods. You guys can do the math. That's what, about 9 birds per, nest that we were being able to band around that time. And these birds, we tracked them daily. When I say we, I don't mean me. I mean the technicians and graduate students. Every day, they follow those birds for 14 days. The hens or the adult birds that had chicks. And then from day 14 to 21, they did it 5 days a week. And at the end of 21 days post-hatch, it's kind of the breaking point for us in the bobwhite world. We kind of consider that a successful nest at that point. So one chick was with that adult at 21 days. They raised a nest. They had successful nesting. That was done. But you can see they had quite the obligation to go through. I mean, there's one of the technicians down there. I mean, we wanted to follow these birds while activities were occurring. So they were following birds right out in front of the fire, everything else, to see what the effects of those were on these birds. So they had fun. Not really. Here's a radio. We just use a regular necklace type radio. We tie it around their neck, around their wings. It sits right here. And then this is the antenna that comes off the bird. This is how we round up those. Since we have the hens radioed, we know where the nest is, right? I mean, so we can follow it back, and starting about 4 a.m. in the morning, they'll show up and we put this trap, not a trap, it's this entrapment system around that nest. And that's to hold all those chicks in, right? They can't fly yet. And then you get down in there on your hands and knees and you collect all those chicks. So you're looking for something pretty tiny in that palmetto and all that stuff. They get them, they throw them in a bucket, and then at the end of catching everything, they weigh them, measure them, and they put these little wing bands on them so we can follow at the time. So if you ever want to have real good fun one morning and, go out and do a brood capture, especially when the mosquitoes are out, it's about the best time you've ever had in your life, let me tell you. And I'll tell you one thing, you'll never go back and do another one. Once you do one, you've pretty much done enough on them. So real quick, kind of the lessons that we learned on these, and we've talked about this, right? The bigger the fire, the more birds move, because they got to go somewhere to find something to eat. The more birds move, the more susceptible they are to predation. That's why, I mean, if I could keep a covey and no bigger, landscape in this room, that'd be awesome, right? The smaller you can keep them, the better. And then we talked about this hazard rate with movement. The more they move, the likelihood of the hazard that they face, death, goes up. Lower survival impacts productivity growth. Now this one, we all went pretty shocked. We all like, oh my God, it's only got 11% overwinter survival on the Webb. This population is doomed. It's going to die tomorrow. When normally we probably get in that 30% range. I don't think it's that low, but I don't also at the same time, I don't think it's 30%. It's probably somewhere in the middle there. We had some low sample size on that, so it's probably a little bit biased. But the good news is when it comes to the Webb is chick growth, chick survival, breeding season survival rates were fantastic. Off the chain, almost as comparable to some of the same best quail plantations up in the part of North Florida, South Georgia. And the reason I say that is that probably bodes well for all the area down here, right? So anybody that's doing that type of management, it probably bodes well down here. Where we were earlier this morning, other type of properties. And it just lets you know, if you got low overwinter survivability and you as a population are still able to increase, you are good at breeding. You got it figured out. And then chick growth, all these type things. And you can see another thing to drive home the importance of burning is these chicks. Home range got burned. You think, oh man, you burned up a bunch of their home range. It's probably going to have a negative effect. Well, it was positive, right? because that's, and you could see from that one graph I showed earlier, where were the hens taking their broods? Into the burned areas. So it just kind of shows, and again, that plays on that scale issue. Chick growth was good, but that breeding season survivability was nearly double on our small scale burn areas than our large scale. So just kind of put that on there, just kind of point home the fact again, burn as small as you can, burn as small as you can get away with on your landscape to do it. It helps the bird. Now don't go out there and burn this side of the road on Monday, this side of the road on Tuesday, then you still got a big burn, right? I mean, kind of spread them out throughout the landscape like we saw this morning. So that's all I got. That was real quick overview of the web. I've been looking at you guys watching me, so that's all I got. Yes, sir.
I know it depends on season, but how far are those range?
Like their home range size? Probably down in this part of the world, you're looking anywhere from 80 to 120 acres, depending on, you know, it could be short. I mean, probably where we were this morning with the supplemental feed and some of the other activities, you're probably looking at 40 acres, 45 acres. So it just depends, like you said, availability of what they need in the landscape. The smaller, the better, obviously. Yes, sir.
How many days before your bird can fly?
How many days before a bird can fly? Oh, geez. Oh, how well?
Just from a predation standpoint.
They're gonna, I mean,
Predator.
yeah, but they're gonna run. It's gonna be their, I mean, that's their first giddy up and go.
The other question I haven't been, but a long time ago, my dad was hunting on bombing range. I've been told by some friends that hunting on bombing range is pretty good. And I have a pretty good idea what it's going to be, what that problem looks like. So explain that habitat. I guess they are maybe is it managed?
The Avon Park?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the bombing, and I mean, this is for real. I mean, I think the bombing takes care of a lot of their management for them. They have those incidental ignition fires at a rate to where it does. And those fires don't usually carry up too far into their scrub. They got that real big, you know, monstrosity scrub. But I think it's the same as Eglin Air Force Base. Where they do most of their bombing and most of their activities have outstanding quail numbers. Problem is nobody can go in there and hunt. I mean, you'd get bombed. I mean, but that's where their best bird numbers are. That's, from my understanding, that's all wild birds. If somebody wants to correct me, I mean, that's all wild birds. Yes.
How's the population?
We were doing jam up, and then when was that? 16 Irma showed up, and it just wasn't Irma, as y'all know who live down here. It rained a lot in May. We got that no-name tropical system that sat there and rained a bunch, and then we had Irma. The rain put a beat down on us. We were the year before almost at an all-time high, and then we went down to almost an all-time low. That quick, 1 year. Last year we saw a nice rebound, clearly not where we want it to be. It's not where it was pre-Irma, but we're starting to figure it out. The birds are starting to respond, so we're starting to get hopefully back in the right direction.
So would you say, looking at the life cycle chart, would you say early summer rain, like a May, June rain, direct correlation to negative
impacts? And it was out there, you know, it was what? I mean, what did we get the 1 month? 8 inches or something, you know, and if it gets so wet to where they can't lay, or as Raul mentioned earlier, the water, I mean, I think out there we were actually getting eggs completely inundated, floating, I mean, leaving. And then just as we started to move into the second nesting phase or that middle part, we had another catastrophic rain event, not associated with Irma. So we were like, okay, we got that done. We're going to put all our eggs in this late season hatch. Boom, Irma. And it just, I'm not sure we had any production or very few that year. It's rough. That's what I mean. You can do everything right and still lose. Yes, Robert?
Do you have a good idea of the amount of nests or the nesting success in the wet season?
Yeah, we haven't. I didn't put it on there. I don't know it off the top of my head, but we do know that information. The birds do fine. There's always high ground, you know, for them to be able to nest on. It's just, and you know here, better than me, it can be wet today and, you know, kicking up dust 2 days later. I mean, it'll soak in. So yeah, they do fine during that period of time.
So I suppose what I'm asking is a little bit of heavy rain every afternoon to get used to it. That seems to be, that's okay.
Yeah, it's those big inundated rains events, like what, 4 days getting 6 or 8 inches. It's kind of a bummer, right? I mean, you know, especially at a time when we had it as some of the higher number we've had probably since the 70s or 80s out there. And then to have that happen, but luckily it was that high when we had the catastrophe, or we'd really be bad off. So I guess there's pluses and minuses and everything, even though that was a pretty big minus. In some of our areas, 2 years past, it's weird. Babcock responded, not great, but this past year, much better than some of our other areas that had impacted from Irma. More rain, sitting there longer, had other rain issues. So that storm did a lot in that swath that it did on that right-hand side of the storm. You go up, you know, in Kenansville, those type areas up there, they got an abundance amount of moisture. And places like Three Lakes, Escape Ranch, they're still down, probably because of Irma. Just goes to show one catastrophic event. I guess that's why it's called a catastrophic event. I mean, it can really do a number on things. So I appreciate y'all listening to me twice today. I can't say it enough, and wish y'all well as you move forward.